Welcome back to Cities After, a radical exploration of the capitalist contradictions shaping our urban world and the many anti capitalist futures to come. This is a Politics in Motion broadcast, and I'm your host, Miguel Robles-Durán. It is no longer enough to see neoliberalism as a system in crisis. What we are witnessing is its deliberate mutation, its final form. I define neo-fascism as neoliberalism's consolidation into an oligarchic regime, an advanced stage of capitalism in which authoritarian governance, financialized dispossession, and the fusion of corporate state power secures capital's dominance amid escalating instability. Neoliberalism was never designed to be a stable equilibrium. Its logic of financialization, its relentless accumulation, and unregulated profit seeking inevitability produced the conditions for its transformation into an openly repressive system. The rise of reactionary politics, nationalist protectionism, and hyper militarized urban policing is not a departure from neoliberalism, but it's a necessary adaptation to crisis and all kinds of growing resistance. This moment demands that we move beyond resistance alone. If we fail to actively imagine and construct anti-capitalist successors to the collapsing neoliberal order, we risk ceding the political terrain to the further entrenchment of authoritarian capitalism. In this episode, I argue that one of these necessary successors could emerge through the development of confederal urban unions, which is a material synthesis of municipalist, confederalist governance structures sharpened by Marxist analysis of capital's inner workings, intersectional class struggle, and radical ecological strategies to confront, of course, the accelerated environmental catastrophe. The following propositions of confederal urban unions emerge from a moment of deep, deep dissatisfaction and urgency. A recognition that our current trajectory offers no viable future. In that moment, I turned to imagination as a political act, pushing myself to conceive a direction forward for the beginning of post capitalist conditions. At this juncture, I believe that this is what we all must do. Actively think beyond the crisis, beyond resistance, and toward the structures that will slowly erode and ultimately replace capitalism with a new eco-socialist order. What follows is a concept note on what confederal urban unions can become, not as a fixed blueprint, but as a framework in development. This is an ongoing process, one that I will continue to co develop through discussions with social movements and by incorporating the critical insights and feedback of listeners like you. Let this not just be a regular podcast, but the start of a collective process of imagining and constructing the political, spatial, and economic structures of a post capitalist world. With this said, I believe it's important to begin this episode with a quick summary on how neoliberalism gave way to neo-fascist rule. The transition from neoliberalism to neo-fascism is not a rupture. It is, as I said in the intro, an evolutionary shift within capitalism's logic. The conditions we are witnessing today, from mass dispossession to the relentless destruction of the environment, are not simply the results of neoliberal excess, but the necessary preconditions for capitalism's authoritarian turn. Not surprising, cities have become the battleground where this shift is most violently felt, as they are the sites where capital, governance, and social reproduction intersect in the most immediate ways. As most of you know, neoliberalism's core premise was the subjugation of all aspects of life to the market. It began in earnest in the late 1970s with the systemic dismantling of welfare protections, the privatization of public goods, and the transference of urban governance into the hands of corporate interests. Housing was financialized, public land was commodified, and urban infrastructures were restructured to benefit the interests of global capital rather than local populations. Of course, this was not a policy failure, but a predictable outcome of an economic system built on systematic dispossession. A dynamic that my friend David Harvey has termed accumulation by dispossession. Far from being a flaw in capitalism, this process is one of its fundamental logics, perpetually siphoning wealth, land, and resources from the many to sustain the power of the few. However, neoliberalism's own success in financializing everyday life created contradictions that could no longer be managed through market mechanisms alone. As housing became a total speculative asset, as millions were priced out of their places where they lived, as labor markets became increasingly precarious, the promises of economic mobility collapsed. The social democratic compromise of mid 20th century capitalism, which somehow maintained a fragile middle class through limited state intervention, was entirely abandoned. In its place emerged an economy in which inequality was not a byproduct of capitalist expansion, it was the expansion itself. As a result, the legitimacy of liberal democracy began to erode. Governments that were presented themselves as neutral arbiters of the economy were somehow revealed to be little more than enforcers of capital's prerogatives. Elections became theater, while real power was consolidated in financial institutions, multinational corporations, and technocratic governance structures beyond public accountability. As mass disillusionment with this system grew, neoliberal regimes faced a critical challenge. How could they maintain control when their economic model no longer had popular legitimacy? The answer was neofascism. Neofascism is not an external force invading liberal democracy. It is the political mechanism that allows capitalism to sustain itself as crises deepen. The transition is not marked by a sudden coup or the abolition of existing political structures. Rather, it is characterized by the steady erosion of democratic institutions, the militarization of urban governance, and the consolidation of power through a combination of state repression, right-wing populism, and oligarchy. Some authoritarian features of this shift include the weaponization of housing and urban space, As I mentioned in the last episode, in many cities, housing markets have been entirely absorbed into global financial circuits, making them completely detached from the needs of their inhabitants. Neo-fascist regimes reinforce this by expelling migrants, criminalizing homelessness, fast tracking evictions, and expanding the police presence in wealthy areas. Under the guise of law and order, they enable further and further accumulation of urban real estate by private interest, of course, while removing any obstacles to its speculative profitability. State backed urban occupation as social engineering is another. While neoliberalism's takeover was driven by market forces, neo fascist occupation is explicitly state driven. Cities falling under authoritarian capitalist regimes are being restructured to prioritize those that have been sold to its evil ideology. Predominantly white, of course, or politically loyal populations. While marginalized groups are forcibly displaced through legal and extra legal means. Anti migrant policies are increasingly being used to frighten the most precarious and as a pretext to displace entire communities from urban centers. While social movements advocating for housing justice are in real risk of being labeled criminal organizations. Urban policing as a tool of capitalist control is another. The expansion of surveillance, militarized policing, and anti protest laws is not simply a response to crime, it is a preemptive measure against class struggle. Neo fascist regimes understand that financialized capitalism is inherently unstable and that widespread discontent could threaten their control. Therefore, urban spaces are transformed into zones of heightened surveillance, where migrants are scapegoated, dissent is criminalized, and resistance is met with brute force. The integration of far right populism into urban governance is another characteristic. Many of the world's rising neo fascist leaders have deep ties to the real estate sector. Figures like Donald Trump, of course, Jair Bolsonaro, have openly championed deregulated development, weakened tenant protections, and expanded private property rights at the expense of working class communities. This reveals a critical point. Neo fascism is not an economic alternative to neoliberalism. It is a political strategy that ensures its continuation through intensified repression. The hollowing out of political representation is another characteristic. While elections continue to take place in many countries, their function is increasingly symbolic. Neo fascist leaders manipulate democratic institutions to serve private economic interests, of course, while dismantling any remaining social protections. This is why anti capitalist urban movements cannot rely on electoral politics alone. To challenge this system, our response must be structural and not procedural. As I speak, many leftist movements still operate under the assumption that liberal democracy can be reformed, that neoliberalism can be regulated, and that economic crisis can be managed through better policies. But as we have seen, capitalism no longer even pretends to accommodate social welfare or democratic governance. This means that any movement seeking to resist neo fascism must go beyond traditional forms of activism. We're not simply in a moment of reaction, we're in a moment of construction. The question is not whether capitalism will continue in its current form, it is whether its transformation will be dictated by the ruling classes or by a revolutionary alternative led by you, me, and the working class. The response to neo-fascism also cannot be defensive. It must be expansive, strategic, and structurally transformative. This is why we need anti-capitalist frameworks that do more than protest injustice. They have to help to actively build the conditions for a new political order. And this brings us to the urgent necessity of expanding our political imagination beyond the confines of the present, towards possibilities that have yet to be realized. My conceptualization of confederal urban unions is precisely that, an initial exercise in imagining a way out, shaped by my experience of nearly 2 decades of collectively attempting to build urban unions across continents. Their foundations are deeply influenced by indigenous communist governance, such as the Iroquois and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also influenced by Murray Bookchin's municipalism, Karl Marx's materialist framework, and of course, my friend's David Harvey's exposure of the capitalist totality. Also, the radical solidarities that the 1969 Rainbow Coalition sought to achieve but never fully realized. I present confederal urban unions as a necessary and feasible, which is very important, reconfiguration of power, a material counterforce to neo-fascism, and a direct pathway towards emancipatory self-governance. But before I continue outlining the general principles of what confederal urban unions are, it is crucial to acknowledge that the landscape of struggle is deeply fractured. Social and environmental justice movements, despite their profound interconnectedness, remained oftenly siloed, operating in isolation rather than as part of a cohesive and transformative force. Recognizing and overcoming this fragmentation is essential if we are to build a unified counterpower capable, of course, to confront capitalism's totalizing grip. The climate justice movement fights against extractivism and environmental devastation, but struggles to integrate a systemic anti-capitalist strategy. Indigenous land defense movements resist ongoing dispossessions, yet frequently operate in isolation from broader urban and labor struggles. Tenant and housing justice movements push back against gentrification and financialized real estate, but rarely link their efforts to larger struggles over territorial governance or the abolition of private property. Labor movements continue to fight against exploitation and precarity, but often fail to incorporate feminist, anti-racist, and ecological demands. Feminist and queer liberation struggles confront patriarchal violence, reproductive justice, and gendered economic oppression, but are rarely integrated into a broader anti-capitalist form of organizing. Anti-border and migrant justice movements resist the policing of mobility and racialized stratification of labor, but often lack structural alliances with municipalist and socialist movements. Decolonial, anti-imperialist, and anti-policing movements challenge militarization, surveillance, and state violence, but remain largely disconnected from all other struggles that I just mentioned. Without a unification that actively weaves these movements into a shared anti-capitalist emancipatory project, they will remain as they are now, absolutely vulnerable to cooptation, isolation, suppression, and strategic exhaustion. Saying this, I still believe that each of the many fracture struggles are incredibly important. But alone, none will be sufficient to counter neo-fascism. I am more than convinced that what is needed is a massive and strategic unification of social, environmental, cultural, political, and economic struggles. Now, let me go over the characteristics and contradictions of some of the main theoretical influences behind the conception of confederal urban unions. A very like well referred one is municipalism. I've made many podcasts about this before. At its core, it is the idea that governance should be reclaimed by people at the local level. It emphasizes direct democracy, participatory decision making, and community control over essential resources. Think of the Zapatista Caracoles in Chiapas or the Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi. These movements have demonstrated somehow, in some way, that municipalism can be a powerful tool for self governance and resistance. And this is because it provides democratic legitimacy. It fosters direct engagement in decision making, giving people direct control over their urban and rural environments. They also emphasize territorial control. Municipal structures, when properly organized, can exert real power over land use, housing, and essential services, undermining the mechanisms of capitalist dispossession. They also give us prefigurative politics. Unlike abstract state-focused strategies, municipalist movements build real material alternatives in the present, offering concrete models of post-capitalist governance. However, municipalism alone also tends to move towards the fragmentation and localism. Without coordination beyond the municipal scale, these initiatives often remain isolated and vulnerable to state and market pressures. There is also the question of economic dependence. Even the most radical municipalist projects often remain tied to capitalist markets, unable to break free from global financial structures. And lastly, municipalist examples have shown a limit to their confrontation with capitalism. Municipalism alone does not provide a clear path for dismantling capitalist relations at a systemic level. On the other hand, another big influence was confederalism. And confederalism extends the logic of municipalism by linking autonomous local political bodies into a network of solidarity. This approach has been powerfully demonstrated in places like Rojava, where Kurdish revolutionary movements have built a decentralized yet interconnected system of councils and assemblies that move towards scalability by linking local struggles into a broader network. Um, Confederalism prevents municipalist projects from becoming isolated or insular. They also provide shared resources and defense. Confederal structures allow municipalities to pool resources to resist external repression and develop economies that operate outside of capitalist structures. They also bring a lot of pluralism and autonomy. Unlike centralized state formations, confederalism allows for self-determination at the local level, while in some way ensuring coordination at a broader scale. But of course, the limits of confederalism are quite vast. I think the most relevant for this discussion is the resistance to engaging with state structures. Many confederalist movements, since they come from anarchist roots, reject any form of engagement with state power, which can limit their ability to defend against capitalist and state violence. They also push for economic self-sufficiency But that remains a challenge. While confederal networks enable collaboration, they do not always provide clear pathways for dismantling capitalist economic structures at the level of production and exchange. In my view, Marxism provides the most comprehensive critique of capitalism, emphasizing class struggle, the necessity to overcome private property relations, and the material conditions required for systemic transformation. It has been the theoretical backbone of many successful revolutionary movements, from the Paris Commune to socialist struggles in Latin America and Asia. Unlike municipalist and confederalist frameworks, Marxism provides a clear understanding of the mechanisms of capitalist accumulation and how they must be dismantled. Class struggle as a revolutionary force is very important for that. While municipalism might emphasize sometimes governance, Marxism places a direct emphasis on the role of the working class in overthrowing capitalist power. Marxism also provides a historical strategy for seizing and transforming power. Marxist movements have historically been able to mobilize mass struggles that challenge the capitalist state directly. However, we cannot deny that through its many historical applications, there has always been a tendency towards centralization that suppresses municipal autonomy and direct democratic participation. Also, Marxist inspired strategies have often prioritized capturing state power without developing autonomous governance structures that can exist beyond the state itself. And lastly, traditional Marxist movements have often focused on the destruction of capitalism without sufficiently investing in the construction of post capitalist alternatives in the present. The contradictions of each approach points to the necessity of what I think is a synthesis that I call Confederal Urban Unions. These entities are not merely tactical alliances between different movements, but the construction of a parallel political order that follows the following general principles. One, intersectional class struggle. Every layer of oppression, economic, racial, gendered, indigenous, environmental, is tied to class struggle. Confederal urban unions embed all of these struggles into a coordinated anti capitalist framework. Unionized economies is another characteristic. Land, housing, and essential services must be gradually collectivized and controlled at the grassroots level, tactically removing them from capitalist speculation. The strategic and gradual abolition of private property relations is another key point. Not just socialized services, but a slow and full transformation of economic structures to ultimately remove capital's control over production and exchange. Another one is strategic engagement with the state. Rather than simply rejecting state structures, confederal urban unions uh, have a strategic function, and that is to erode and replace state functions, provide resources necessary for the empowerment of the unions. Another key point is that they allow for a transnational coordination. Localized struggles must move beyond borders, building a global confederal networks that actually challenge capitalist institutions at a planetary scale. Let me remind you that neo-fascism is already organizing itself along these lines. They are consolidating territorial control, building transnational alliances, and integrating economic strategies that secures capital's dominance. If anti-capitalist movements fail to construct a similarly strategic initiative or alternative, we will remain trapped in cycles of defensive struggles while capitalism continues to evolve further and further into more repressive forms. Now, after all this, let me outline in 5 points how confederal urban unions can serve as one of the foundations for building a feasible revolutionary horizon, and how we can move beyond fragmented resistance to the active construction of post capitalist futures. One, radical democracy and dual power. At the core of confederal urban unions is direct democracy, not as a vague ideal, but as a tangible practice of self governance at the local level. This means dismantling representative political systems that serve capitalist interests and replacing them with participatory structures where all community members have decision making power over their local territories. The urban unions must become the primary institution of governance, replacing state bureaucracies and city councils, dominated by real estate developers now and corporate interests and political elites, of course. Direct popular decision making is also something that is very implicit into these urban unions. No reliance on politicians or intermediaries, urban unions must gradually aim towards the making of all major decisions regarding land use, infrastructure, and social policy. Also, have to understand worker control production. Beyond governance, workers must progressively move toward self management through, of course, translocal democratic councils, ensuring that economic decisions are driven by collective social needs rather than capitalist profit motives or motives. This dual power strategy is what I mean when urban unions have to resist being operated as mere experiments within capitalism, and their members must actively challenge and replace existing institutions, creating parallel power structures with the long term goal of rendering the capitalist state obsolete. Without this material foundation of dual power, confederal urban unions could risk devolving into yet another reformist project that ultimately adapts and sustains capitalist structures. While they may initially operate in parallel to existing institutions or capitalist institutions, their trajectory must not be one of mere coexistence, but of actively dismantling and replacing slowly capitalist governance with a radically democratic and eco-socialist alternative. Two, on anti-capitalist territorial control. Capitalism dominates urban and rural space through private property relations, and of course the speculative financialization of land and housing. Confederal urban unions target territorial control that removes these essential resources from capitalist markets. How? But by unionizing land and housing. All land and housing and urban infrastructures should slowly be placed under collective or cooperative ownership. No entity, corporate, private, or state, should have the power to buy, sell, or accumulate land for profit. Also, socialized housing models. The public should not be reduced to a minimal welfare function or receiver, but public must become the dominant form of urban living, controlled through cooperative union structures rather than state bureaucracy. Urbanization beyond capitalist logic is an ultimate goal. This means the progressive reconstruction of rural areas, cities, transportation networks, infrastructures, social services, and resource distribution must also be directed at some point by urban unions and their confederations. Grounded in the principle of socially necessary labor time and oriented towards a symbiotic relationship with the environment. This approach prioritizes collective well being, ecological balance, and the equitable allocation of resources based on social and material needs. This is not just about securing basic needs, it is about dismantling capitalism's special foundation step by step. Capitalist urbanization, as we all know, thrives on rent extraction, financial speculation, and commodification. A new social order based on confederal urban unions would have the necessary power to break this cycle by, again, unionizing territorial control and embedding in it democratic governance. Three, on confederal coordination and the scaling of municipal power. One of the primary weaknesses of municipalist experiments has been the tendency, as I've said before, of remaining isolated from one another. And that makes them easy to suppress and co opt. Confederal urban unions address this problem by linking autonomous entities into a shared network of governance. So, beyond localism, municipal power must be scaled into a translocal and transnational forms of alliances that prevent capitalism and state forces from isolating and repressing these radical municipalities or entities. Each urban union must elect to become a confederate, rotating recallable delegates to confederal bodies that coordinate decisions across regions while maintaining desired urban union autonomy. And yes, cultural identity too. They should also work on strategic resource sharing. Urban unions must create a collective economic and social infrastructure that functions through cooperative supply chains, decentralized energy grids, and confederal healthcare systems to slowly, again, reduce dependence on capitalist markets and state run institutions. They also should provide resistance and defense, and the resistance should happen with networks. Confederal structures must also enable urban unions to collectively defend against state and capitalist repression, ensuring that no single union is left vulnerable to attacks or economic blockades. This confederal structure ensures that urban unions progressively form a cohesive planetary force capable of gradually dismantling capitalist structures at multiple scales. Four, on ecological socialism and degrowth. At their core, confederal urban unions and raison d'etre or reason of existence is to reject the capitalist imperative of endless growth, which, as we know, drives environmental destruction, extractivist economies, and planetary degradation of all sorts. Instead, their direction should be a clear prioritization of eco-socialist approaches rooted in degrowth principles and environmental justice principles too. The main goal of urban union economies should be to eliminate fossil fuel dependence by transitioning to regenerative and non-extractive systems of energy production and consumption. These energy production, water supply, waste management, food systems, and resource redistribution must be progressively redesigned around confederal urban unions into controlled, renewable, and non exploitative models. The planned degrowth of harmful industries is an imperative task of the confederations. Sectors of the economy that are inherently destructive, such as for profit mining, luxury real estate, global finance, and mass tourism, must actively be dismantled. While productive sectors that are reorganized to serve, of course, social and ecological needs. Capitalist urbanization is inherently unstable. Confederal urban unions should not only propose alternatives, but actively struggle to dismantle the economic structures that drive climate catastrophe. And five, intersectional class struggle. Confederal urban unions are political and spatial formations that integrate intersectional class struggle as its foundation. Class struggle is multidimensional. Economic exploitation, racial oppression, gender violence, environmental destruction, and indigenous erasure are interwoven systems of capitalist control. Liberation cannot be achieved by focusing on any of these struggles in isolation. Urban union structures must be built on this kind of radical inclusion. Assemblies, cooperatives, and governance structures should be designed to amplify the voices of historically marginalized groups, ensuring that power is not replicated along capitalist, patriarchal, or racialized hierarchies. Land and resource redistribution beyond capitalist reparations. I mean, this is a very important one. Instead of reparations, the redistribution must move beyond state-centric policies of inclusion and instead be embedded in a radical imagining of intersectional principles of urban union cooperation towards really true equality. By embedding intersectional class struggle in its core, confederal urban unions ensure that human and non-human emancipation is inseparable from environmental, racial, gender, and indigenous justice. This prevents it from falling into the historically narrow frameworks that have limited past and present socialist movements. To clarify further, unlike the libertarian or anarchist confederalism proposed by Bookchin and Öcalan, confederal urban unions do not ignore the role of the state in maintaining capitalist control. The state formation is not merely an abstraction. It is the central institution that organizes capitalist power. Therefore, confederal urban unions must pursue this dual strategy of undermining the capitalist state legitimacy by building parallel institutions that make state structures increasingly obsolete, by transferring governance, social services, and economic coordination, of course, to confederal urban unions, also by seizing resources from the state. Where possible, confederal urban unions must strategically work on progressive redirection of state resources, land, public funding, infrastructure, towards urban union projects. They also must preempt state repression. Confederal structures must anticipate and resist the inevitable attempts by state forces to dismantle union power, as it has happened, whether through legal means, deregulation, austerity, or force, military intervention, or police crackdowns. The development of confederal urban unions presents a viable anti-capitalist horizon. Yet those committed to its realization must recognize that achieving a new era of emancipation will be a generational struggle. I mean, one that demands sustained collective effort, strategic perseverance, and the gradual, slow dismantling of capitalist structures, of course, over time. This long-term commitment resonates with the seventh generation principle, an ancient Haudenosaunee philosophy that urges us to consider how today's decisions will shape the world in 7 generations ahead into the future. While this principle has been commodified in contemporary discourse, its original intent was to ensure that social, political, and ecological choices could sustain life beyond the immediate moment. And that offers a profound ethical and strategic guide for anti capitalist movements. The Confederal Urban Union framework must not only address the immediate crisis of capitalist urbanization, but also cultivate new kinds of institutions, different forms of making infrastructures, and social relations that will endure far beyond the present struggle. Like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, it's a confederacy, which wove its political, ceremonial, and social fabric with a vision spanning centuries, those building confederal urban unions must resist the impatience of short term victories and instead lay the ground for a truly emancipatory future for generations to come. This means structuring governance, economic production, and ecological stewardship in ways that do not merely react to capitalism's crisis, but that actively construct a world where future generations inherit functioning, just, and sustainable systems from the logic of capital. So we are no longer, to repeat, in a moment where resisting capitalism's latest mutation, which is neofascism, is enough. As I said at the beginning, the real question is what comes next? What is the material alternative to capitalism? And how do we unite struggles to begin constructing it today? I mean, the imagination of confederal urban unions, I don't see it as a utopian aspiration for a distant future. See it as something that could be necessary or is necessary and immediate, as an immediate project, a parallel trajectory that must be taken seriously before authoritarian capitalism further entrenches its power. The foundations of this parallel world are already being built, as you know, through countless struggles unfolding across the planet as I speak. Worker controlled cooperatives, cultural collectives, land occupations, labor unions, symbiotic science networks, and municipalist initiatives. Yet, as I've already been saying, these struggles remain largely fragmented, and their potential is constrained by isolation. Without a larger, coordinated movement that builds power across multiple scales, the window for revolutionary transformation will continue to close. Our first task in forging confederal urban unions is not only to engage with these existing struggles, but to actively weave them together, creating a shared framework for collective emancipation. This means breaking the silos that keep our movements and keep us disconnected, urging us, ourselves, and them to recognize their interdependence and integrating their efforts and our efforts into a broader systemic challenge to capitalist domination. Only through this convergence can we transform scattered acts of resistance into a unified core capable of reshaping the urban and territorial landscapes of the future. For decades, progressive movements operated under the assumption that capitalism could be restrained through social democracy, that the state could be reformed to serve the interests of the people. That assumption is dead. Liberal democracy has been absorbed into the machinery of neo fascist capitalism, reducing electoral politics to a spectacle merely reinforces existing hierarchies. We cannot afford to waste time pursuing reforms that will only delay the inevitable crisis to come. I realize that the scale of this task is immense, but so is the urgency of the moment. Let me make this clear. No struggle succeeds in isolation. Confederal Urban Unions requires organizers, activists, radicalized workers, and everyday people reclaiming union power in their own workplaces, neighborhoods, communities, public spaces, parks, and urban infrastructures. If you are engaged in tenant struggles, workplace organizing, or environmental activism, begin forging links between your movement and other anti capitalist struggles, locally, regionally, and globally. If you are working within progressive local governments, push beyond reforms and towards a radical reconfiguration of governance itself. If you are involved in cooperative economies, connect them to a broader vision of territorial control, ensuring that they do not become enclaves within a capitalist system. If you find yourself in an area without existing structures conducive to the integration of confederal urban unions, then take the initiative to build from the ground up. Begin by organizing intersectional local assemblies, spaces of direct democracy that unite workers, tenants, activists, and community members across struggles. Every autonomous assembly established today is a step towards constructing the counterpower necessary to dismantle capitalist domination and forge a new urban order. The future is unwritten, but we must begin drafting it now. Neofascism is not waiting for us to organize. Every delay, every moment of hesitation, every concentration into your own silo allows capital to tighten its grip. The longer we remain stuck in outdated political frameworks and fragmented struggles, the more difficult it will become to break free from capitalism's deadly trajectory. But history is not predetermined. The revolutionary horizon remains open, and the movements that are willing to take bold action in the present will determine what kind of future is possible. Let me repeat this again. The time for resisting capitalism's crisis without a plan for what comes next is over. It is a time for constructing the material foundations of a post-capitalist society. And that, I'm sure, has already begun. This is Cities After, and until next time.